In this presentation, I will discuss the ongoing water allocation crisis in Central Asia. There are 6 primary countries involved in this conflict: Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, and Turkmenistan. Right now, tensions are highest between Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan, so those 3 are the focus of the discussion here. Around 80% of Uzbekistan is arid desert and steppe, specifically the western part of the country. In the east, where it shares borders with Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, are the foothills of the Tian Shan Mountains. The country as a whole is arid, with annual rainfall averaging about 10 inches. It can get quite a bit more in the eastern foothills, though. 2 river basins are found in Uzbekistan that form the Aral Sea Basin: the Amu Darya River Basin and the Sir Darya. The Amu Darya Basin covers about 81.5% of the country, and the Sir Darya covers about 13.5%. 95% of the country's area is contained within these 2 drainages. The majority of flow for the Amu Darya is generated in Tajikistan, and almost all the flow for the Sir Darya is generated in Kyrgyzstan. Virtually all of the viable farmland in the country lies within the valleys of these 2 rivers. Kyrgyzstan is quite a bit different than Uzbekistan in terms of landscape. Instead of flat, steppe, desert, arid conditions, most of the country is covered by the large mountains of the Tian Shan and the Pamir Alay ranges. 94% of the country is at least 1,000 meters above sea level, and about 40% of that is greater than 3,000 meters above sea level. There are 6 major river basins in the country, with the Sir Darya being the largest. All rivers in Kyrgyzstan originate there. No rivers flow into the country from anywhere else. About 4% of the country's surface area is covered by glaciers, which, combined with snowmelt, generate much of the water that flows through Kyrgyzstan's basins. Kyrgyzstan also boasts the world's 2nd largest high mountain lake, Issyk Kul. I have no idea if I said that right. Has a surface area of about 6,000 square kilometers. Unlike Uzbekistan, who has reserves of coal and gas, Kyrgyzstan is resource poor. Water is the primary natural resource in the country. Tajikistan shares many of the same characteristics as Kyrgyzstan. It's very mountainous. Most of it sits at 3,000 meters or more above sea level. It is a more arid country than Kyrgyzstan, however. The country is home to 4 primary river basins, including the Amu Darya, which provides most of the water resources for the country. Large glaciers cover the country in the high mountains and can receive annual precipitation as high as 94 inches. But most of the rest of the country is arid. For this reason, almost all the agriculture needs to be heavily irrigated. Primary exports are aluminum and cotton. So, like Kyrgyzstan, natural resources are not nearly as abundant as a country like, say, Uzbekistan, especially as related to fossil fuels for electricity generation, which is a big problem in the water resource allocation problem that will be discussed. The Amu Darya Basin average annual flow, calculated by adding the internal renewable surface water resources, or IRSWR, of the different countries in the basin, comes to 78.46 cubic kilometers per year. Of this amount, Tajikistan's share of the IRSWR is 59.45 cubic kilometers. The total flow generated by the Sir Darya is estimated at 36.57, of which 27.42 cubic kilometers per year is attributed to Kyrgyzstan. By contrast, the IRSWR for Uzbekistan is only 4.7 cubic kilometers per year for the Amu Darya and 4.84 per year for the Sir Darya. Uzbekistan is withdrawing around 49.16 cubic kilometers per year of 48.87 cubic kilometers per year available renewable surface and groundwater, or 101% of their renewable water resources. Looking at the numbers, the RSWR for Uzbekistan is 9.54 cubic kilometers for river flow, with an additional 8.8 cubic kilometers of renewable groundwater. 2 kilometers of that is considered overlap with surface water, however. So that gives a grand total of 16.34 cubic kilometers of renewable water available. Total actual renewable water resources, or the TARWR, It's a mouthful. Based on outflow agreements with upstream countries and internal sources, is 48.87 cubic kilometers. The total withdrawals per year are 49.16, as I mentioned earlier. This means that Uzbekistan is relying on Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan to allow at least 32.82 cubic kilometers to flow into the country, or about 67% of their water needs. Kyrgyzstan, on the other hand, is flush with water. Their IRSWR from the 6 river basins is 46.46 cubic kilometers per year, plus renewable groundwater of an additional 2.47. But they have secured outflow agreements with other countries that amount to 25.87 cubic kilometers per year. The largest agreement being with Uzbekistan and Tajikistan for a secured outflow of 22.33 cubic kilometers. And this all comes from the Syr Darya. This leaves Kyrgyzstan with an available 23.06 cubic kilometers per year, and their yearly withdrawals are only 7.71. So they only withdraw at the moment an average of 33% of their available resources. Finally, Tajikistan, like Kyrgyzstan, is also rich in water as an available resource. The IRSWR for Tajikistan is estimated to be around 60.46 cubic kilometers per year, with an additional 13.31 incoming, and an additional 3 cubic kilometers of renewable groundwater. Tajikistan also has outflow agreements that add up to about 54.86 cubic kilometers per year, leaving their internal available water resources at around 21.91. Their total withdrawals are about 11.2 cubic kilometers, or about 51% of their available resources. The Syr Darya flows about 2,200 kilometers from where it originates in the Tian Shan Mountains and flows through Kyrgyzstan, known there as the Naran River, and combining with the Kara Darya to become the Syr Darya. The Amu Darya originates in the Pamirs, where the Vaksh and Panj rivers meet and forms the border between Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Afghanistan. Well, it forms the border between Tajikistan and Uzbekistan with Afghanistan. The river flows for about 2,500 kilometers before draining into the Aral Sea. These two river systems account for 90% of all of Central Asia's surface water and 75% of all water needed for irrigation for agriculture. Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan only account for about 20% of the area making up the Aral Sea basin, but they account for 80% of the water resources. The conflict among these countries didn't arise until after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the date these countries became autonomous. Prior to the collapse, the Soviets had implemented a resource sharing system in the area. Say what you like about the Soviets and communism, but in this situation, the system worked to everyone's advantage. By the late 90s, independence created a situation wherein decisions based on self-interest caused the Soviet system of cooperation to break down, and conflict over resources, specifically water, arose. Because of the Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan control of so much of the water in the region, the Soviets had in place a plan where in fall and winter, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan would collect water in dams, and in the spring and summer, water was released for the irrigation of downstream crops. In return, downstream countries, like Uzbekistan, would provide oil, gas, coal, and electricity to these other countries in the winter. The way this system ended up breaking down is that by the mid-90s, just a few years after the collapse, the newly independent Uzbekistan no longer had a surplus of electricity or gas to trade, so they began asking Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan market value price for energy. These two countries couldn't pay these prices, so they began releasing water in winter to power hydroelectric facilities. This has damaged the ability of Uzbekistan to acquire enough water in the summer months for their massive irrigation needs, and has led to incredibly large amounts of tension in the region. As it currently sits, Kyrgyzstan produces 93.3% and Tajikistan 98.8% of their electricity from hydropower. However, this isn't really saying much because Tajikistan can only provide its population with about an hour or less of electricity per day during the winter. The conflict revolves specifically around wintertime electricity generation from the Togol Reservoir in Kyrgyzstan and the Rakam Reservoir in Tajikistan. Uzbekistan believes that they should continue to store water, or these countries should continue to store water in winter for summer irrigation at downstream locations. Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan are not blameless, but the consensus seems to be that the largest fault falls on Uzbekistan for their severely outdated irrigation and growing practices, as well as the cessation of providing electricity to the upstream countries in exchange for the water. They want to profit from the sale of energy, but also expect these countries to provide them all the water they need. Uzbekistan's irrigation system is so inefficient that it is estimated that 50 to 85% of the water used in irrigation is lost, and only 25 to 35% of the water that makes it to crops is used efficiently. As a result of decades of these poor irrigation practices, the Aral Sea has been reduced in volume by about 80%. A former official in Uzbekistan even had this to say about his own country's policies, and this is quoting him. Farmers are told they have to grow cotton, and the way they water the fields of cotton is very old-fashioned. They should use new modern methods to do it, but the government does not want to spend money. They could buy cotton picking machines, but it is cheaper for them to use children and the people's labor for cotton picking. Uzbekistan cries about the lack of water, but it is not true. It is an artificially created problem. So that's a pretty powerful testimony. Salinization is another problem stemming from the poor irrigation practices, again primarily in Uzbekistan, but also affecting other countries in the region. It is reported that over 50% of the irrigated land in Uzbekistan is affected by salinization because of the nature of their irrigation practices. In a 2012 report, U.S. intelligence stated that while water allocation concerns by themselves were unlikely to lead to failed states, the water crisis, in conjunction with poverty, social tensions, environmental degradation, ineffectual leadership, and weak political institutions, could lead to a failed state status in the future. Tajikistan is currently working on the Rogun Dam on the Vaksh, a dam that began construction in '86 under Soviet rule, but is slowly being constructed as funding allows. The dam will be 335 meters tall and generate 3,600 megawatts. The World Bank backs this project, saying that this is the lowest cost option for Tajikistan to meet their energy needs. A similar but smaller dam is also being constructed in Kyrgyzstan. Uzbekistan is violently opposed to the building of these dams, especially the Rogun in Tajikistan. Islam Karimov, the Uzbekistan president, warned that water resources could become a problem in the future that could escalate tensions not only in our region, but on every continent. I won't name specific countries, but all this could deteriorate to the point where not just serious confrontation, but even wars could be the result. So as you hear there, Uzbekistan's president threatened war over this issue. So Russia has given Tajikistan support for the Rogun project and has stated that if Uzbekistan took military action against either Tajikistan or Kyrgyzstan, then the full force of the Russian-led Collective Security Treaty Organization, or CSTO, would be used to defend the two countries. On top of all of this, problems are predicted to get worse soon. Partial thawing of the Tian Shan and Pamir glaciers that feed the Amu Darya and the Sirdarya rivers have provided good flows in recent years, but it's predicted that by 2020 glaciers will have lost their critical mass. This means that very soon spring flows could be significantly lower and the rivers will be more susceptible to drought. So clearly, there are high stakes surrounding this water allocation crisis: potential failed state status, war, regional instability, food supply concerns, salinization, and shrinking of the Aral Sea. But solutions for many of these are available. If the countries involved would put aside distrust and work together on a solution, for one, then the problem is quite manageable, according to many sources. But this is always easier said than done, especially to outsiders looking in. The World Bank stated that reform of Uzbekistan's agricultural sector is, quote, one of the most obvious and cost-effective ways to adapt to the water allocation crisis in the region. Most of the irrigation in Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan is simply surface irrigation. Overland ditches, often lined only with clay, carry water to where it is needed for crops. Surface irrigation is the least efficient method for irrigation because there are so many ways to experience water loss, such as evaporation, or percolation of water through the soil, particularly before it even reaches the crops. The FAO, or the Food and Agricultural Organization of the U.S., estimates that clay canals are only 80% efficient as a conveyance of water versus 95% for lined canals, and field application efficiency for surface irrigation is only about 60%. Uzbekistan, with assistance from Russia and other international donors, desperately needs to upgrade their irrigation to, ideally, a drip irrigation system. Drip irrigation doesn't suffer the same conveyance inefficiencies, and its field application efficiency is around 90%. For every 1 cubic kilometer of water used in Uzbekistan for irrigation, only at best 0.48 cubic kilometers is making it to the crops efficiently, according to the U.S. numbers above, the FAO numbers. But it's probably way worse than that. As mentioned earlier, some estimates put only 25 to 35% of water reaching crops effectively. Alternatively, drip irrigation would deliver between 0.85 and 0.9 cubic kilometers out of 1 kilometer of water to the crops effectively. This means that the 54.4 cubic kilometers worth of withdrawals Uzbekistan averages for agriculture annually, approximately 26.1 cubic kilometers is being utilized for plant growth in the most generous estimates. It may be as low as 13.6 cubic kilometers. With drip irrigation, 48.96 cubic kilometers of the 54.4 cubic kilometers withdrawn would potentially make it to crops. Drip irrigation is expensive, so social and institutional reforms would need to be implemented. Proposed reforms from the 2014 International Crisis Group includes proposals for agreements by the Central Asian countries with one another, as well as agreements with the UN and the donor community, specifically talking about Russia, China, and the European Union. These agreements should establish separate water sharing agreements for the Sirdarya and the Amur Darya. Water sharing agreements would need to be bilateral and also address energy sharing issues. The 2014 report states specifically that for the donor community, prior to assisting these countries, the following priorities should be the expanse of infrastructure modernization programs in urban areas regarding water meters and improved sanitation, and in agriculture areas regarding modern techniques such as drip irrigation. Donors need to prioritize water issues at the highest levels of engagement with the 3 governments and use international and local media to publicize the need for progress. They need to work with the smallest units of government, such as townships, city managers, community groups, and such, to mitigate corruption and make funding conditional on the implementation of anti-corruption measures. And they need to create energy sector reform that includes anti-corruption measures for large hydropower projects. For the countries of Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan, the actions, according to the International Crisis Group, that should be taken by these countries specifically is that they need to commit to resolving border problems without using water or energy as a coercive factor, and facilitate cross-border cooperation between police forces and form intra-regional council to oversee day-to-day management of water and land resources. Officials need to investigate and prosecute corruption and misuse of money. They need to begin public education programs that stress the extent of water wastage in the countries. And they need to ask donors to develop cross-border economic development projects focusing on border issues, including management and maintenance of shared water resources for agriculture. There's a large mountain to climb for all parties involved in this water allocation crisis. Poor irrigation practices and regional distrust are combining to create a situation that's going to be increasingly difficult to de-escalate. If nothing is done, instability and possibly even war could erupt in the region. Any agreement reached is going to be meaningless if irrigation practices are not addressed. Water availability is predicted to decrease in the near future. The socio-political concerns around this issue are so high that nobody at the moment is even concerned about addressing the salinization and dramatically lowered water levels in the Aral Sea. Eventually, if the other concerns can be worked out to some satisfactory level, the Aral Sea is going to be an ongoing problem that will need to be addressed. it's kind of crazy that good irrigation has the potential to play a role in avoiding war. Here are my sources, and I apologize that was such a long presentation. Thank you.